So I've come up with 5 helpful hints for reading Mere Christianity, and I thought I'd walk you through those. I was speaking with a colleague, and I asked for one piece of advice about reading this book, and he pondered for a moment, and then he said, dig in. Now, I think the man is right. I think that this is a book that really will repay a careful reading. I think this is a book that you'll probably return to time and time again throughout the course of your life. I think it might have a really powerful effect, and some of the lines and passages may become real stalwarts for you and make up part of your mental furniture and your spiritual furniture as you think about your relationship with God, and more importantly, of course, His relationship with you. So dig into this book, lean in. It's not going to be just another read. It might make a lasting impression if you let it. Secondly, not only dig in, but keep a dictionary at hand. C.S. Lewis, you see, was a failed poet. He published 2 books of poetry early on in his career before his conversion to Christianity. They went nowhere. But he continued to write and to publish poetry in magazines and newspapers, and for his entire life always wrote in such a poetic way. Perhaps many of you have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and the other Narnias to your children and have noticed how well he turns a phrase. And so he's choosing words very deliberately. He also is condensing down a whole lot of material into a small space for the BBC radio broadcasts. And so he's going to get a lot of mileage out of every word. So keep a dictionary at hand, and if there are any words that he says, anything that he enunciates in that book that you don't quite understand, go ahead and look it up. I, in fact, have learned many words in my vocabulary just from trying to read and understand Lewis. So, dig in, grab a dictionary, and then thirdly, slow down. This is a book that will repay a careful, deliberate consideration. Another thing that my friend said was, don't do it at night. It's a good thing to do when you're mentally fresh. And I would suggest, at least at the beginning, but actually every rereading that I ever read, I stop at the end of one chapter. As I mentioned, each of these chapters were a brief 10 or 11-minute radio broadcast, and that's how I suggest you read it. Go ahead and read it slowly. Read it and let the words work on you. Even today, as I was reading a passage of Lewis to my students, I realized that I had read the whole sentence wrong, and I got all stumbly over my own words. When I slowed down and read the commas in their place and made sense of what Lewis had meant to say, everything fell into place. But I found again that Lewis made me slow down and pay careful attention to the words on the page. And that's just one of the ways that Lewis has taught me how to think. If you slow down too, those passages that he belabored, that he labored over and crafted, those will begin to work on the right parts of you. It's not a book to be read hastily. It's a book to be read carefully, slowly, with some real consideration, and I'd certainly suggest one chapter at a time. Dig in, grab a dictionary, slow down. What's next? Well, I'm going to suggest that you read and reread that book out loud. Reading it out loud will do a couple of things. First of all, Lewis always advised his students to write for the ear, not for the eye. Walter Hooper tells me that as Lewis was writing, he would dip his dip pen, and as he was writing in pen and ink, Lewis would mouth over the words that he was about to write. Now, of course, Walter Hooper came at the end of Lewis's life in '63, not 20 years earlier when he was writing Mere Christianity, but I'm betting that this is an old habit of Lewis's. He was writing for how it would sound out loud. One of the things you may consider doing is getting a copy of the audiobook, either on Audible, get the CDs. Another thing I do as you slow down and read aloud, I would stop at the end of a paragraph. Maybe you want to read it with someone else and stop at the end of paragraphs and ask them what they understood. Discuss what you've understood. There are some ringing, clear sentences and passages, things that may well kind of crawl inside of you and take root. It certainly has worked for me and for millions of others that this book just has these ringing phrases and passages that provide for me kind of guidelines by which I live my life. Another thing that you may want to consider doing, Lewis suggested that maybe a schoolboy could increase his reading pleasure by imagining where he was in the situation. And so when he hit the trenches in World War I and he heard the first shell whizzing over his head, his reaction, according to Surprised by Joy, was, well, this is war. This is what Homer wrote about. So he mitigated or used a filter of his reading experience for his daily life, and the same works the other way around. Lewis says about fairy tales that they can often work powerfully on us. He suggests that maybe a boy who doesn't like the cold meat he's being served for dinner might dip that meat in story by imagining that he hunted the thing himself with a bow and arrow. In the same way, I suggested to one of you after Sunday school on Sunday that perhaps one way to put yourself in the mood to hear this book is get a copy of the audio and then maybe throw up some blackout curtains or close the curtains in your home and make yourself a cup of tea. Maybe dress up or imagine anyway the audiobook as a radio. And imagine what it would be like for a family huddled around the radio listening to the BBC as the bombs were falling. Maybe imaginatively put yourself in the same situations as the first hearers. That might be another way to make that book more enjoyable. In terms of small groups, I'll very often read a chapter or have somebody read a chapter or take turns reading a chapter out loud, and then we'll stop after the chapter and we'll discuss it. Having a Bible handy is always good. Lewis was steeped in the Old and New Testaments, and he read the New Testament certainly in Greek. But there are lots of images that are ringing through, and some of the hints that you remember, some of the hints that you hear, will be certainly things that you remember from the Scriptures. So, dig in, grab a dictionary, grab your Bible as well, slow it down, read and reread the passages out loud, and maybe consider dipping Mere Christianity in the story of its original context. Listening, and not just listening to it, but listening to it as if you were there in the early 40s when Lewis's voice boomed out on the radio.